appreciate the invitation from the Union League to be here. Appreciate the invitation from the Illinois Academy of Criminology to have an opportunity to address what Professor Fowles and I think is a very important topic. I was reminded again of the importance of this topic when I had a chance this morning to have breakfast with Alice Norris, who lost a daughter to gun violence here in Chicago and has been active in the anti-violence movement ever since that's occurred. And as maybe one way of sort of depicting the topic we'll be talking about this morning, our first slide here shows an event that took place not too far from where I'm speaking this morning on December 31st of 2016. 764 crosses were carried down the street that I understand you all refer to as the Magnificent Mile. Each one of those crosses representing a victim of homicide here in Chicago in the year 2016. And so as we try to figure out what happened in 2016, that's the subject that brought Professor Fowles and me to this research question. And so we will start looking specifically at, well, here's the event that came to our attention. You can see depicted here over a 10-year period of time the number of homicides in your city of Chicago. And I shudder to use the word, but there seems to be a baseline, if that's the right way to describe what's going on, of about 500 homicides a year, every year in the city of Chicago, until, as you see on the last bar there, in 2016, there's a sudden increase to 764. That's a 58% increase in homicides in 1 year. It's the largest single-year homicide increase in the last 25 years among the 5 most populous United States cities. And so Professor Fowles and I had been looking at this. In fact, the reason I think that we got engaged in this topic is the victims that are involved in these kinds of numbers. My sister's involved with the inner city school program, charter school program here in Chicago, trying to improve the educational system. And one of my children volunteered in an area here in Chicago, the North Woodlawn area, in the summer of 2015, and working in the inner city school. When she came home after that, the next year, of course, was 2016, and we watched in horror as some of the same places where she had been working that summer suddenly became part of national news as the homicide rate here spiked. And of course, the concentration of the victims was something that was evident as well. Sadly, there didn't seem to be sadly, the homicide victims seemed to be concentrated in some of the most disadvantaged communities here in Chicago. In fact, 78% of the victims were African American, 16% were Latino, and 5% were white. And so Professor Fowles and I, watching this news, we got together in about March of 2017 and thought, this is such a dramatic one-year increase that there must be something underlying it. And maybe with modern statistical tools, with all the data that's now available, if we can't explain why there are 500 homicides a year in Chicago, which I know criminologists have been debating for many decades, perhaps we can explain what changed in 1 year. That seems like such a unique phenomenon that maybe we could get to the bottom of that. So what I want to ask you to do this morning is join Professor Fowles and me as we investigate what caused the 2016 Chicago homicide spike. And again, our focus here, as you can see from the little graph, is we're not trying to explain the underlying levels of homicide in Chicago. We're trying to explain what statisticians refer to as the delta, the change. There's a change of about 250 additional homicides in 1 year. And so that's what we're attempting to explain. Of course, if somebody can figure out the rest of the story, that's to be commended as well. But there were so many things going on, we're going to focus on that one single event. The Chicago homicide spike is what I'll refer to it as. So I guess the first question you might have is, all right, when did the spike begin? Let's see if we can identify a time frame here. And on this point, Professor Fowles and I were able to get from the Chicago Police Department, which kindly shared with us data that was useful for this project. And you see depicted here 5 years of monthly homicide data for the city of Chicago. And the one thing that immediately jumps out, as you can see there, is pronounced seasonality is the way the statisticians refer to it, as that in, for example, July and August, there are more homicides committed than there are in January and February, due, I guess, to the weather patterns. People are more out on the streets during the summer months than they are during the winter months. And you can see here over the 5-year period, seasonality is shown, and then you see at the end there a sudden increase. Can we figure out exactly when that increase occurred? Well, here's some data on that. Professor Fowles and I used what's known as the R statistical program, a standard econometric program, which has within it a feature known as struct change, or structural change detector. And you can take a data set and ask the program to identify, is there a break, a structural break, a change in the data set? And we collected data for 4 dependent variables, 4 things that we're trying to explain. Of course, we're trying to explain homicides in the city of Chicago, also fatal shootings, which is slightly lower than homicides, since homicides can be, of course, committed in various ways. Also, you could have non-fatal shootings, and if you sum those two together, fatal shootings and non-fatal shootings, you end up with total shootings. So those are going to be the 4 data sets that we'll be referring to today. Those were the 4 variables that we were trying to explain. And when you use the struct change program, we were able to identify, again, within a sort of zone of uncertainty, a confidence interval, if you will, that homicides seem to have changed around January of 2016, fatal shootings around December 2015, non-fatal total shootings around October 2015. All of those, because of the confidence bands, would permit the conclusion that something changed in the city of Chicago around November 2015. That is, beginning, let's say, December 1st, 2015, something changed in the world here in Chicago. So that's the answer, I guess, to the question of when did things change. It seems like around December 1st, 2015, give or take a month or two, something changed. Now, one thing you might say, okay, well, homicides are going up in Chicago. Did they increase in other parts of the United States? And here we've collected data showing the 2015 compared to 2016 homicide increase in the nation's 20 largest cities, in addition to Chicago. And you'll notice that the median increase in 2016 was 9.8%. Half of the cities in the country a little higher, half of the cities below. And you'll notice that Chicago is at 58% increase, the year-to-year increase. Most of the other cities are far, far below that. There are a couple of cities here that are somewhat high. San Antonio, where if you look into it a little bit, apparently the police thought that there was an increase in spontaneous killings. Austin had about 12 more killings in 2016 than 2015, and that produces a very dramatic increase given the small number of homicides every year in Austin. But the overall picture here is clear that there wasn't some national trend causing a 58% spike in homicides all over the country. The Chicago spike, then, we believe is not part of some national phenomenon. Might it be part of a regional phenomenon? And here we've collected data, again, for the year-to-year increase from what I'm going to be geographically challenged here. I suppose I would call these Midwestern cities, St. Louis, Indianapolis, so on and so forth. Gary, Indiana, by the way, which I understand is just about 25 miles from where I'm standing now. And you can see that none of these other cities had a year-to-year increase even remotely approaching Chicago, with the possible exception of Louisville, which had a 47% increase. If you talk to people in Louisville or look at the news media as we did, apparently there was a local gang increase there that caused homicides to spike in that particular year. But the conclusion we draw from this is that the Chicago spike was not part of some regional phenomenon, because we don't see the same sort of increase in other Midwestern cities. How about things in Illinois? Maybe what was going on in Illinois had the explanatory power here. Well, here you see a slide showing the increase if you look at homicides for all parts of Illinois except Chicago. You have about a 4% increase. You'll notice the middle bar there is the national increase, about 9%, and then you'll see the increase for Chicago at 58%. So again, we draw the conclusion that the Chicago spike doesn't seem to be something that was going on within the state of Illinois, because we don't see the same pattern reflected in the homicide data in other parts of this state. We also collected data by looking at the FBI reports for what are known as index crimes. The criminologists here will be very familiar with that term. The FBI collects data on 7 index crimes: murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, and vehicle theft. And here you see on this slide Chicago's year-to-year 2015 to 2016 increase over those 7 crime categories. And you'll notice that murder increased 58%. None of the other categories appear to have anything approaching that. The largest is robbery at 23%. And again, robbery might have some connection to firearms, since some robberies are obviously committed with firearms. The rest of the crimes don't have anything. I guess the largest is aggravated assault at 20%, and the other ones are smaller. So again, we see something now that seems to be concentrated in the homicide area. Interestingly, the city of Chicago, through your Chicago Police Department, which has a quite well-known statistical unit to it, they collect data on non-FBI standard categories. These are shooting categories. And if you look at the 4 categories for which the CPD, Chicago Police Department, maintains data, you'll notice that homicides increased 58%, fatal shootings increased 66%, non-fatal shootings increased 44%, and then the total shootings increased 48%. So we're looking at a phenomenon that seems to have been concentrated within gun-related crimes, homicide, and the specific shooting crimes here. So the conclusions that Professor Fowles and I drew from this when we looked at this set of data was, if we're trying to identify what caused the Chicago homicide spike, well, then what we should be looking for is something that caused an abrupt change near the end of 2015. It should be something that remained in place throughout 2016, because our structural break detector did not see any reversal of the structural breaks that we identified around November of 2015. It should be something that occurred uniquely in Chicago and not as part of general changes affecting other parts of Illinois, the Midwest, or other parts of the United States. And it should be something that significantly and specifically increased gun crimes, because we see this concentration of the increase in the gun-related crimes, not the other areas. And again, I think this part of the argument should be relatively uncontroversial. I don't know that anyone could really disagree with any of the points that we've just put together now. I know there'll be a commentator later on from Professor Maltz. He may have some thoughts on this, but I think this part of the presentation should be something that everybody could agree with. So then the question is, all right, if this is what we're looking for, what are the options that might fit this? And here we have the benefit of research that was done by the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which in January of 2017 did a report on the gun violence issues that we're talking about this morning. And they said, and they reviewed all the literature, your newspaper articles, talked to people in the area. This is the list of things that they came up with as possible explanations for the Chicago homicide spike, such things as fractured gang hierarchies or high rates of neighborhood poverty and segregation. You can see the other things that are listed there. They have about 14 or 15 different possibilities. And when Professor Fowles and I looked at this list, one thing immediately jumped out to us. It's the last item on the list here. Implementation of an agreement between the city and the American Civil Liberties Union concerning street stops. We thought that this perhaps best fit those 4 factors that we were looking for in a causal explanation for the homicide spike. And so that became our hypothesis then. Is the ACLU agreement regarding street stops, the implementation of that agreement, the causal factor for the homicide spike? So we began looking into that. And one thing we noticed, again getting data from the Chicago Police Department, and this we believe to be data for all the street stops that I'll refer to them as street stops, but all the stops that the Chicago Police Department conducted. Again, we're looking at the same 5-year period on a monthly basis, and you'll notice that street stops were running around maybe 40,000 a month, give or take, over the 4 years leading up to that line that I'll talk about in a moment. You'll notice a little bit of seasonality there. Just as crimes increase a bit over the summer, street stops appear to increase a little bit over the summer. And then we've put a vertical line right where our structural change detector suggested something had changed on the city of Chicago, and that vertical line is at the end of November, beginning of December 2015. And you'll notice at precisely that point in time, street stops take a precipitous drop, going to below 10,000 a month. So this slide is important to consider we're not looking at some marginal change here. My friend Professor Fowles refers to interocular trauma. That is something that hits you right between the eyes. This is something that dramatically changed. We're talking about an 80 to 85% reduction in a particular form of policing here in the city of Chicago that occurred around November, December of 2015. Again, I'm not saying that it went from 100% to 80%. Let's be clear. It's going from 100% down to 20%. This is an 80% delta. This is a huge change in a form of policing here in the city of Chicago. And so the question then becomes, all right, is there some connection between these two events? And what you notice on this particular slide, if you're going to remember only one thing from my presentation, I would ask you to remember this particular slide, where we have depicted very simply and very straightforwardly two things. The blue line is police stop and frisks, and the orange line is homicides. This is not seasonally adjusted data. This is month-to-month data. And you'll notice what seems to be a correlation here, that the stops decline at the same time as homicides go up. And so is this, of course, correlation doesn't prove causation. The question becomes, though, did this decline in stops cause an increase in homicides? And how might we go about exploring whether there's a causal connection? Because I know causal research is something that criminologists and others struggle with at all times. So we are trying to dive in to explain the possible causal connection here. And the first approach that we took was, all right, what did people in the city of Chicago say was going on at this particular time? And from what we can understand, reviewing media reports, and I'm hoping perhaps we'll have a discussion here today with people who are knowledgeable, but here's one quotation coming from the Chicago Sun-Times. A police officer is quoted as saying, "Gangbangers now realize that no one will stop them, and people who wouldn't have carried a gun before are now armed." That's what police on the streets, and this is just one illustration, appear to have been saying at the time. Well, I know some of you might be saying, if you're of a skeptical bent, well, sure, the police are going to say that. They're going to deflect attention. It's going to not be their fault. It's going to be somebody else's. So what if we find somebody who wasn't a police officer? What if we find, for example, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, the Chicago area, Zach Farden? He was appointed by President Obama, I think generally regarded by the community here in Chicago as a nonpartisan person. And when President Trump asked him to leave, as he asked all the U.S. attorneys to leave, Mr. Farden wrote a letter of resignation saying, look, I think the city of Chicago needs to know what's going on our streets. And this is a quotation. There's a longer letter, of course, but I think this is the point that's most important to our discussion today. Mr. Farden says, so by January 2016, the city was on fire. The cops had to worry about the ACLU deal. Many of them became scared and demoralized, so the cops stopped making stops, and the kids started shooting more because they could, and because the rule of law enforcement had been delegitimized, and that created an atmosphere of chaos. So again, Professor Fowles and I weren't here in Chicago, and we weren't knowledgeable about what was going on the streets, but we think that U.S. Attorney Farden, who was apparently keeping his thumb on the pulse of the city, has identified precisely what we think might be the causal factor as an explanatory factor, which you see here as well. So if we're starting to think about causation, we had this correlation, and now we have knowledgeable people saying, yes, this is the linkage. What else might we do if we're trying to investigate cause? Well, we might look for underlying criminological research. And conveniently for us, the National Academy of Sciences in November 2017, just 4 months ago, released a report reviewing all the literature on stop and frisk. And you can see on the slide here that the National Academy of Sciences concluded that what they referred to as stop, question, and frisk, that the evaluations of these focused use of enforcement tactics have included pedestrian stops report meaningful and statistically significant crime reductions at targeted locations, though estimated jurisdictional impact when measured has been modest. So the National Academy of Sciences has said, yes, if stop and frisk goes down, crime goes up. So again, the causal linkage that we're trying to draw is not some newfangled invention or something that's contradictory to criminological research. In fact, it seems to be quite supported by a comprehensive review of the literature published just 4 months ago. Interestingly as well, some of the studies suggest that there's a unique link between police stop and frisks and gun crimes. And again, simply quoting from some studies here that the National Academy of Sciences was summarizing. A study in Indianapolis found that targeted offender gun patrols reduced gun-related crimes substantially, but did not appear to affect other violent crimes without firearms. A study in New York similarly found stop and frisk didn't seem to affect robbery or burglary rates. So when we're looking at stop and frisk, we're looking at something, not surprisingly, right? Stop and frisk is focused on frisking people to find firearms or to stop people to obtain firearms. It wouldn't be surprising to see that it has a unique effect on firearms violence, and in fact that seems to be what the underlying empirical research in other contexts suggests. So how might we go about investigating this causal question a little more closely? Did stop and frisk increase homicide? We noticed that we have a decline in stop and frisk causing an abrupt change near the end of 2015. It remained in place throughout 2016. As you could see, stop and frisk remained at the lower levels throughout the year. We know that this change occurred uniquely in Chicago, not as part of some other change in Illinois, the Midwest, or the United States. And we know that it likely increased gun-related crimes specifically. So this now becomes part of our causal argument. How else might we investigate cause? And I'm going to bring Professor Fowles in just a minute or two, but let me, since I'm here in the room, what we decided to do was regression analysis, which is a standard approach for investigating these kinds of questions. And again, you see, if you look at the columns, we have 4 columns here on what I'm calling our basic regression equations. The 4 that I mentioned: homicides, fatal shootings, non-fatal shootings, and total shootings. And then down the left-hand side, we have what econometricians refer to as the explanatory variables. The first explanatory variable is Chicago stop and frisk, that is the number of stop and frisks each month. And you'll notice that Professor Fowles and I have highlighted this in yellow. This was something that made the econometrician on the team, Professor Fowles, I think his heart beat a little faster when we saw that we had triple stars across all 4 of the equations. That is statistical significance at the 99.9% confidence level. And the signs are as expected. That is, as stop and frisk decline, you would expect homicides, fatal shootings, non-fatal shootings, and total shootings to increase. The other variables we have listed there, by the way, are temperature as a control for seasonality, 911 calls, which I'll talk about in a moment, Illinois homicides, that is the homicides occurring in the state of Illinois if you back out the city of Chicago as some control for other things going on in Illinois. And then we also have a series of arrest variables for property crime, violent crime, homicides, gun arrests, shooting arrests, drug arrests, and a trend over time. We can do our regressions, by the way, with even more variables. Here we collected data for about 6 or 7 other cities: Gary, Indiana, let's see, I can't recall right off the top of my head, Columbus, Louisville, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Detroit. If you put those into the equations as control for other events that might be taking place in other parts of the country or the Midwest, that does not change our results. We continue to have statistical significance at either the 99% or 99.9% confidence interval for the stop and frisk variables. And then one last slide, and then I'll ask Professor Fowles to jump in to talk a little bit about our statistical methods. We use something called Bayesian model averaging to determine whether or not inclusion of particular variables affected our conclusions. This is a measure of robustness of the equations. If you have 20 variables, as we did in our last regression equations, theoretically you could take 2 to the 20th, that's about 2 million possible different ways of scrambling the variables. And if you looked at those 2 million equations, what percent of them would indicate that stop and frisk was an explanatory variable appropriately included? And the answer is 100.0%. That is, out of the 2 million equations, stop and frisk remains explanatory across all 2 million equations. So sometimes you have regression results where if you take a little pepper out and add a little more salt, you get a different result. That's not the case here. I'll turn the time over now to my colleague, Professor Fowles, who can talk a little bit more about some of the statistical methods that we employed.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for allowing me a few minutes to talk to you about the research finding. As usual, Professor Cassell has done a wonderful job explaining the data and how we went about analyzing it. For this and other papers we worked on, we begin with a very pure univariate time series that at some point exhibits a pronounced change. That's the interocular trauma. Matching the change to a trigger requires something outside of the data. It might be a large econometric or structural equation model that exhibit feedback mechanisms and so on. paper, we've chosen to use one of the simplest procedures. Ordinary least squares estimates on reduced form equations are easy to understand and can describe data patterns quite well. Our results allow readers to see the correlations amongst the data and to be able to judge both the statistical and, more importantly, the practical significance of the estimates. Of course, whenever more than one explanatory variable is used in a regression, so something beyond a simple correlation coefficient, there's a considerable amount of art that comes into play, and we are well aware that different researchers would tend to select models that might either amplify or mute the effects of any selected variable of interest. So there are at least two fundamental kinds of uncertainty in using simple ordinary least squares when it comes to detecting the relationship between a favored variable and the target. The influence of an explanatory variable is not known, and the model itself is not known. A typical and unfortunate consequence that arises when analyzing non-experimental data is one that you can find radically different magnitude effects, even including sign switching for a focus variable when mixing other variables into the model. Of the new kinds of ways of simultaneously addressing the issues of parameter and model uncertainty, we have favored Bayesian methods, and in particular, those that can nicely accommodate linear models. Bayesian model average results are intuitive and have several nice properties. The estimate is attenuated. Another is that the important variables are selected in a coherent way. And another is that the reader can scan through a large number of candidate models to see if a finding is fragile or not. And here we mean fragility refers to the sign patterning of variables across all the models. Before I turn the slide over to Professor Cassell again, I think we can conclude what we do find is parameter stability across a vast array of models. And a sensible conclusion is surely that there's something in these data that might point to a causal relationship. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. So we have this data, and as Professor Fowl suggests, it does seem to point in the direction of a causal relationship. But the next question then becomes, all right, how are we going to reach this causal inference? We want to emphasize that our causal inference does not rest on one leg of a stool, but rather what I would describe as a three-legged stool. We have our regression equations, which, as Professor Fowles indicated, seem to be very stable, particularly with respect to the sign, that is, decreasing stops mean increasing homicides. We have contemporaneous recognition, that is, we have qualitative research from people in the city of Chicago attributing the increase in homicides to the decrease in stops. And we also have underlying empirical research from, as summarized in the National Academy of Sciences, the underlying mechanism being recognized. So again, we haven't created some mechanism that no one else has discovered before. We've simply seen an illustration of a mechanism that appears to have been identified in other research. Now, the next question that arises, though, when you reach a causal inference, as Professor Fowles and I are attempting to do, is what is known as the omitted variable problem. Have we left out of our regression equations a variable that, if we put it in there, would explain the increase in homicides? And so now this becomes a bit of a treasure hunt, I suppose, to try to identify, is there something else that we left out of the equations? And one possible candidate might be the release of the Laquan McDonald shooting video. You all live in Chicago, so I'm sure everyone is familiar with the release of this particular video. And it occurred about the time that we're interested in. In fact, it's very easy to construct a timeline of the relevant events involving this video. On October 24th, McDonald, who was, I believe, a 17-year-old African-American young man, was shot and killed by a Chicago police officer. The officers were cleared, but over the next few months, it didn't look like that clearance was legitimate. And in fact, by April 15th of 2015, the Chicago City Council voted 47-0 to pay $5 million to the family. The question then became release of the video. It was litigated, and ultimately on November 24th of 2015, the video was released. Hundreds of people protested, according to the Chicago Tribune. The Department of Justice ordered an investigation. There were continuing protests. In December, for example, there were a far smaller number of protests. Protests continued to linger on through about April of 2016. Could this release of the McDonald's shooting video have been the trigger for the Chicago homicide spike? I suppose that's a theoretically possible explanation, but how would we empirically test that? What would be how do you test the hypothesis, falsify it, or verify it? The literature out there, including a recently published study by Matthew Desmond in the American Sociological Review, suggests that based on data in Milwaukee, where there was a highly publicized beating of an African-American man, 911 calls to the police fell after that event. And so the empirical test of this particular theory would be to look at 911 calls. So we asked the Chicago Police Department, and here is the data for 911 calls during the 5-year relevant period of time. And you'll notice a long-term downward trend in 911 calls. I would be interested to hear from this group, and we have an inquiry into the Office of Emergency Management Communications, I believe it is, as to what they think is going on over the long term. But the key event for us is, again, you can see the vertical line. There doesn't seem to be a unique change in 911 calls at the time of the Chicago homicide spike. And by the way, if you're interested, what happened in 2017, 911 calls declined even further. So the idea that there was some change in police-citizen cooperation, at least as measured by 911 calls, doesn't appear to be empirically validated. This is the one standard measure that we could find for this particular event. What else might have triggered the homicide spike? Well, remember on December 6, 2015, the United States Department of Justice announced an investigation into the Chicago Police Department that concluded in January of 2017. However, with the election of President Trump, there was no longer any interest in a consent decree. And in July of 2017, the Illinois Attorney General sued the Chicago Police Department. Litigation that we understand is still continuing. However, the Justice Department investigation, it's important to understand, was focused on the Chicago Police Department's use of force, not on stop and frisk. The McDonald's shooting, of course, involved a use of force, and that was the focus. In fact, if you read the ultimate report from the U.S. Department of Justice, there was no substantive mention of stop and frisk, even in that, I believe it was a 100-page long report. No consent decree, of course, was ever imposed. And if you look at a recent interesting study that I'll be referring to a couple of times today by Professor Russian, who is currently at the law school here at Loyola, and Mr. Edwards, who's a statistician down in, I believe, the University of Alabama, published in the Cornell Law Review. They looked at whether the announcement of a Justice Department finding was linked to crime rates. They found no such effect from the announcement of an investigation. They did find an effect from the ultimate consent decree, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But so we see no reason to believe it's the Justice Department investigation that triggered the homicide spike. How about changes in police leadership? Again, this is something that I read about in the newspapers from a distance, but I understand you're aware that the superintendent, Mr. McCarthy, was fired in November of 2015 by the mayor. Perhaps that created instability in police leadership, but it is important to understand that a new and respected veteran who came from the ranks of the Chicago Police Department, Eddie Johnson, was in place in March of 2016. And so if this is some notion of instability in leadership, it seems to have been resolved and wouldn't explain a decline, some problem that existed throughout 2016. How about fractured gang leadership? We're sometimes told that gangs are now fragmented, and as a result, the individual gang members are more violent because there's no one at the top to exercise control. I suppose, again, that's a hypothesis, but we all understand that Chicago has had high levels of entrenched gang problems for many years before 2016. In our longer paper, we show that there have been fragmentation of gangs that was occurring well before the homicide spike. And now if we start to see, is this theory empirically supported or contradicted, what we learn is that gang-related homicide victims remained essentially stable from 2015 to 2016, going from 53% to 54%. If you look at gang-affiliated homicide or shooting suspects, it actually declined modestly from 73% to 67%. So the notion that this is some kind of a gang-triggered event, again, does not appear to be consistent with the data that is available. How about the opioid epidemic? The city of Chicago, tragically, like many other cities across our nation, is struggling to deal with this surge of drugs. However, the surge started in Chicago well before 2013 seems to be the common date for the increased usage in opioids. It continued through 2016, surely, but it's continued through 2017, 2018. No unique change from what we could tell in opioid usage or distribution around the time of the homicide spike. And let's remember, if this is the trigger for the Chicago homicide spike, opioid problems are not confined to urban areas, but they afflict all parts of Illinois, all communities, by the way, across the country. And is there some unique connection to shootings? We really haven't seen that appear anywhere in the criminology literature. So we don't believe the opioid epidemic, while a tragedy in this country, is the explanation for this particular event. How about weak gun control laws? There's been a great deal of discussion, as there should be, about the nature of gun control laws here in the city of Chicago, particularly since you're adjacent to another state, Indiana, which has a different firearms regulatory regime. That is certainly worthy of great discussion and something that we believed was not the cause of the homicide spike, because there was no change in the legal regime. There was no something that happened in November of 2015 that would suddenly lead to new guns coming into the city of Chicago. Your city seems to be awash in guns, but you seem to have been awash in guns in 2015 as well as 2016 as well as 2017. So this doesn't seem to be the triggering event for the homicide spike. And indeed, if we look at firearms recoveries by the Chicago Police Department, they remained essentially unchanged from 2015 to 2016, about 6,700 in 2015, 6,600 in 2016. So gun control laws, while again a subject very worthy of discussion, do not appear to be the cause of the event that we're investigating. How about educational or social spending? I know that you had a budget crisis here in the state of Illinois, but those kinds of things are longer-term events. They take place over years, if not decades. And interestingly, if we're looking at social spending, it actually increased from $547 million in 2015 to $561 million in 2016. Graduation rates in your school system appear to have increased in 2016 as well. Again, there certainly is ample room for debate about what kind of an education system the city of Chicago wants to have, whether social spending should be increased or decreased in light of fiscal exigencies, but that doesn't seem to be triggering the event that we're looking at here. What about New York? Now, one question that has frequently been raised in response to our paper is, well, Professor Cassell, have you looked at the decline in homicides or increase in homicides in New York after stop and frisk fails? Professor Fowles, have you run the numbers on that? And so it's certainly a fair question. What does the experience in New York show? I think our first answer to that question would be, well, what about Chicago? We think that every city has a story to tell on crime. Chicago's story may be unique from New York's. And it may be the case that what happened in New York is something different that's happening in Chicago. In fact, are there differences between New York and Chicago that are relevant to our discussion this morning? We believe absolutely there are. New York's homicide rate in 2016 was 3.9 per 100,000. Chicago's was 27.8. That's, I don't know, 8 or 9 times higher here in the city of Chicago. New York's homicide firearm rate, which seems to be the event that we're focusing on, was 2.3 per 100,000, whereas yours was more than 10 times higher, 25.1. Now, we also know that New York City has a large police force, 25% more officers per capita. And so if you do the math, per firearms homicide, NYPD has 260 employees, whereas the Chicago Police Department has only 19. Put another way, if we're looking at the event in question, firearms homicides, New York City has 1,000% more, actually higher than 1,000% more policing power to throw at that particular problem. And of course, firearms homicides are much more difficult to solve than our other homicides. And while we're talking about the difficulty of solving homicides, your city has 67% gang-related homicides compared to New York at 23%. And notoriously, gang-related homicides are much more difficult to solve for reasons that I think are well known to this group. So New York's experience doesn't seem to be something that would be typical of the country for that matter, and certainly not typical of what would happen in your city of Chicago. What about other cities too? And here I'll refer back to the study that I mentioned a moment ago by Professor Russian at Loyola Law School in your city and Mr. Edwards down at the University of Alabama. They looked at consent decrees that the United States Justice Department had imposed all over the country based on a collection of 17 cities, not including, by the way, either New York or Chicago. They concluded that violent crime rates were higher after the imposition of a general consent decree, and property crime rates were higher when they were subject to a consent decree as well. And so this is consistent, as we will explain in a moment, with our theory that the ACLU consent decree may have led to an increase in crime. Now, one other thing you might be wondering, all right, with all this violence in the city of Chicago in 2016, what happened in 2017? Well, your city chose to respond. The mayor increased the police force by roughly 500, or 4% of the force in 2017. There was a rollout of new data-driven command centers. 44 new surveillance cameras were placed in high crime areas in your city. Gunfire detection technology was employed in various places. The feds were sent in, although the number of feds that were sent in was not as large as perhaps some would have hoped for. 3 new prosecutors and 25 new ATF agents, firearms agents. No change in stop and frisk policies. So those are all, I think, very valuable initiatives and very good things that your city did. Although as I look at that package of responses, I'm not convinced that this is going to suddenly make a huge difference in your homicide rate. And so it'd be interesting to look what happened in your city. We were focusing on 2016, but what happened in the next year? Well, here's what happened. We see in 2017 a modest decline in homicide rates, but sadly not returning to the baseline level of 500 a year that existed before November of 2015, which would be, again, consistent with our theory that maybe something more significant had taken place 1 year earlier and that something had not been corrected by 2017, although the good news for your city was that there was a modest decline that you can see depicted there in homicide rates. Now, what else might we wonder about? Okay, stop and frisk fell. Why was that? And here, I suppose our paper diverges a little bit from the quantitative approach to a more qualitative approach, because figuring out why the Chicago Police Department did something may not be subject to quantitative analysis. It might be a new command decision. It might be decisions that police officers are making. We've got to figure out what caused the drop in stop and frisk. By the way, if you disagree with this part of the paper, I hope you'll still come away with the idea that there was a decline in stop and frisk that led to an increase in homicide. I understand that there may be some debate about this point, but because your city needs to figure out what caused the homicide spike, we want to try to explain what caused the drop in stop and frisk. And here again, we have the benefit of Mr. Farden, your U.S. attorney, who was the one who said, look, the cops had to worry about the ACLU deal. The ACLU deal, as some of you are aware, was signed into effect in August of 2015. It required the Chicago Police Department to keep a very extensive set of records whenever they made a stop. In fact, what you can see here, and this is only one page of a 2-page form, it's a 70-field form. Let me make sure I'm enunciating that clearly. Not 17, it's 70 field form. 70 pieces of information have to be entered for each stop and frisk. And sadly, I don't have the backside of the form here, but the backside requires a narrative that is a lengthy explanation of why any stop was made. Apparently that explanation is not something that is routinely done by hand, but has to be done by word processor, is my understanding from some of the officers on the street. So that requires an officer to go back to the desk or whatever and complete it. And so it wouldn't be surprising that with this kind of record-keeping requirement, officers are maybe not going to do as many stops as they did before. They also might have been concerned, as I think Mr. Farden suggests, that these forms are now going to the ACLU with badge numbers and so forth, and they're going to get in trouble if they make stops. And so we would expect that this might lead to a decrease in stops. In fact, if you ask the ACLU what happened about all this, it's kind of interesting to look at what they said when Mr. Farden mentioned the ACLU deal as a possible cause here. Karen Shelley of the ACLU, your Illinois branch of the ACLU, by the way, in March of 2017, in response to Mr. Farden, said, Mr. Farden is wrong that the agreement took effect on January 1st, 2016. The agreement had been in full force and effect for 4 months by that time, because that's when the agreement was signed. Seems like a plausible argument on its face. However, as Ms. Shelley must surely have known, the agreement wasn't implemented the second it was signed. The agreement specifically called for a change in stop and frisk to be implemented, quote, by December 31st, 2015. You wouldn't imagine that on August 15th, you would sign an arrangement with the Chicago Police Department, and on August 16th, it would immediately lead to these changes throughout the police force. There is obviously a phase-in period, and in fact, one of the very sad things about this whole story is it doesn't seem like the ACLU was interested in having an extended phase-in period. But the truth is that the agreement essentially took effect shortly before December 31st, 2015. From what we can tell, it might have been, in the weeks leading up to this is when the agreement went into effect on the ground in terms of affecting day-to-day policing by the Chicago Police Department. And in fact, before the homicide issue became such a prominent concern in this city, it's interesting that the same Ms. Shelley of the ACLU said, oh yeah, of course there's a decline in stops. That's a good thing. That's what we were trying to do. That's what we were telling our organization we were achieving through this reduction, through this agreement. So it's not some cockamamie idea that the ACLU agreement led to a reduction in stops. That's what the ACLU was trying to achieve and what they, in fact, were taking credit for, at least as of February 2016. What were the police doing instead of stop and frisk? That's an obvious question, and we think we have an answer. The answer is traffic stops. What we see here is 2015 to 2016 data on the number of traffic stops conducted by the Chicago Police Department. It goes from about 86,000 in 2015 to about 190,000 in 2016. I don't know what percent increase that is, but you can see visually there. It's essentially a shift of Chicago policing power away from street stops and into traffic stops. Now, why would they be doing that? The answer that we're hearing from officers on the street is, look, nobody can mess with me if I do a traffic stop because I can run radar, and when somebody's 11 miles over the limit, I can pull them over, and I'm not going to get any trouble, and nobody is going to call the ACLU on me because that's a perfectly valid stop. My basis for the stop cannot be contested. By the way, would we expect traffic stops to be particularly effective in fighting homicides? I would submit the answer to that is obviously not. It's not something that's commonly viewed as one of the law enforcement tools to deal with homicide, and particularly in your city of Chicago, which, like many other cities, follows a no-chase policy, which means if somebody's going to be stopped and they're a bad guy with a gun, all they have to do is continue driving, and they will receive in the mail several weeks later a fine, a ticket requesting payment of some sort of fine. So against that backdrop, the idea that traffic stops would be effective in fighting homicides, I think it makes it clear that they would not. So we have a shift of police power away from something that would be uniquely effective in fighting gun violence to something that would be, I think, uniquely ineffective. We're able to quantify the human toll involved in what we're looking at here. And again, as Professor Faust mentioned, we're able to use Bayesian model averaging, which gives us an average coefficient over literally 2 million equations. And when you multiply that coefficient, which is a relatively small coefficient, again consistent with the National Academy of Sciences, against a large reduction in stop and frisk, you generate these numbers. And again, these are approximations. We don't claim to be able to specify things perfectly, but it is interesting to look at the magnitude of the effects that we're talking about. Let's take the most conservative model, that is the model with cities. We would estimate that 236 additional homicides occurred in the city of Chicago based on the reduction in stop and frisk. In other words, if stop and frisk had remained at the same level in your city in 2016, 236 people would be alive today. I was going to mention Alice's daughter at this point, but I think you understand the human toll that we're talking about here. We're talking about 1,100 shootings that occurred, and it appears to have occurred due to human error, if you will, a change in policy that could have been avoided. What is the quantification of this cost? Roughly 1,100 additional shooting victims. What is the cost of this? And again, I shudder to use those terms. We're talking about, this is a standard figure from the University of Chicago that's frequently used. 1 million per shooting, 1.4 million in current dollars. That's a $1.5 billion social cost that was inflicted by the change in stop and frisk, if our numbers are accurate. And the victims, of course, behind every one of those numbers is a human being, life that is lost. The ripple effects extend far beyond these individuals. Of course, we're also able to quantify the fact that these costs are concentrated in disadvantaged communities within your city. About 184 of these lives would have been African American and 38 would have been Latino, since I know that there is some question about how stop and frisk works. Now the victims, again, if our conclusions are correct, 236 people would not have had crosses carried down your magnificent mile on December 31st, 2016 if stop and frisk had continued at the same level. Now we realize social costs exist with stop and frisk as well. We realize we're not blind to the fact that stop and frisk has been a controversial policy. And we acknowledge in our paper that stop and frisk involve a restriction of liberty of the persons who are stopped. If they're frisked, and that doesn't happen every time a stop occurs, then you're going to have an even greater intrusion on someone's dignity, if you will. Stop and frisk can also affect the perceptions of law enforcement in particular communities. These are potential costs that have to be evaluated as part of a full cost-benefit analysis. But those costs have been frequently articulated in your city. Those costs have been trumpeted in newspapers and from various organizations. But some organizations like the ACLU have said, look, we can get rid of all these costs at stop and frisk without any trade-off whatsoever. And the one point that Professor Fowles and I are asking you and other policymakers to consider is we do not believe that's accurate. We believe that there are trade-offs, and we believe that those trade-offs have to be considered when you look at stop and frisk policies. Now, what are the policy implications? Our findings can be read to suggest that Chicago policymakers, and perhaps policymakers in other cities, but our focus has been on the city of Chicago because we're able to drill down so deeply on the data here. We find, first, one thing that should be done is a reassessment of stop and frisk policies through full cost-benefit analysis. Now, we understand that the costs of stop and frisk are going to be borne on certain communities within Chicago, particularly minority communities. But at the same time, our data suggests that the benefits of stop and frisk policies are not going to be evenly distributed across the city of Chicago. They will also come to those communities. And we think that one thing that needs to happen, and this is our second point, is that in particular minority communities need to be told about some of the findings that we've come up with here. They have been told, I believe in some situations, that stop and frisk does not have a rational basis, that it is simply focusing on minority communities for reasons of unfairness in the Chicago Police Department or other things such as that. Our findings suggest that the stop and frisk policies were actually designed to provide a life-saving benefit to people in those communities by reducing the levels of firearms violence. Another point that we believe should be considered is removing or simplifying the stop and frisk form. And let me be clear. Here I'm talking about the 70-field form that the ACLU agreement requires. That is a burdensome form that takes law enforcement officers off the street and provides a particularly strong disincentive to stop and frisk. Do you need that detailed form in the year 2018? Particularly when your city has just become the largest police force in the world, as I understand it, that is equipped with body cameras. I understood that one of the reasons that the record-keeping requirements were imposed was to make sure that cops didn't do something inappropriate or hassle someone for no legitimate basis. Well, now every officer in your force is wearing a body camera. If they're doing something wrong, surely that's a much stronger deterrent to misbehavior than would be filling out a piece of paper somewhere. And our final point is that we believe there should be more research through randomized controlled trials on the efficacy of stop and frisk. We understand that our study is not perfect. We understand that it relies on what is known as a non-experimental basis. We think we have a change in stop and frisk policies in Chicago that suddenly came along unanticipated that then triggered this homicide spike. But there are surely other things that might have occurred that might have had some bearing on our findings. Let's go investigate that. Let's go have a controlled jurisdiction and an implementation jurisdiction and see what happens. That surely is a conclusion that this group in particular could strongly endorse. Our final conclusion is that we would be remiss if we failed to mention one thing. We think that this conclusion is in some sense blindingly obvious. Once we showed you the chart that there's a decline in stop and frisk and an increase in homicide, that a lot of people, including people in this room or people who are affiliated with criminologists in this room, would have rushed to their regression equations to try to figure out what was going on. And yet we were constantly struck by the fact that it seemed that no one was interested in this topic. No one wanted to take what might be described as the politically incorrect view. Everybody wanted to think that we could reduce stop and frisk in the city of Chicago without anyone paying the price. Well, unfortunately, our data suggests that the real world may be much more complicated than that. So I want to conclude with this slide, which is the 764 victims of the Chicago homicide spike 764 people who were killed in your city in 2016. Surely your city needs to figure out what happened and investigate this, because too much is at stake. So I believe Professor Maltz is going to provide a response, and I appreciate the opportunity to come to your city and share the findings that Professor Fowles and I have been working on over the last year.
If you look at the language of the Terry versus Ohio decision in 1968, which created stop and frisk, Justice Warren, who authored that opinion, said in a part that's kind of overlooked, while we're concerned about the effect of this new procedure, allowing the police to stop people on less than probable cause and just on mere suspicion that they're perhaps about to commit a crime, while there's a concern about how this will affect minority communities, we're also concerned about the effect on of changing police practice on overall prevention of crime. He was foresighted enough to have this kind of concern about a dilemma of stop and frisk. All right, Michael Maltz is kind enough to lend his presence. He is an emeritus professor of criminology from the University of Illinois here in Chicago. His PhD is from Stanford. He focuses his research on the reliability and accuracy of crime data. And I'd ask Professor Maltz, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Okay, with your permission, I will read rather than try and speak extemporaneously. One of the things I look at in reading or reviewing a paper is the extent to which researchers go beyond just presenting their findings and instead try to attack it in as many ways as they can. This paper withstands that test. They looked at as many plausible alternatives to what they call the ACLU effect and saw nothing to contradict their, let me call it, tentative conclusion. Let's face it, there are always more models that you can try or more variables that you can include. The fact is that the authors used what they feel was the best data and analyzed it in appropriate ways. Well, it's never possible to say definitively that A caused B when B happens to be over 700 different events caused by over 700 different people. They did the best they could with the data they had. But there are some issues with the data that they are unaware of. Since I've been dealing with police collected data for over 50 years, I don't take data at face value. I like to, as I used to tell my students, smell the data. And I'm quite familiar with homicide data, but was not as familiar with stop and frisk data. So I spent Tuesday morning with a friend of mine, a district commander, and got a lot of insight from him and his colleagues. And in fact, you know, you might say that you have to listen to Professor Harold Hill. You've got to know the territory, you know, from the Music Man. And I have to learn the territory, and I think that by looking just at data, you don't really see the territory. When Gary McCarthy came here from New York to Chicago, he brought CompStat with him. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a computer program that is used to analyze crime statistics, and they used it not the way we envisioned it when we developed it, because it was developed here in Chicago as Professor Lombardo and I were on that project on computer mapping of crime. That's when he was a sergeant, I believe, at the time, and now he's emeritus professor. When we developed it, it was used as a means of showing patterns of data. Now it's used more and more to make sure that each district gets its numbers up. So CompStat's focus on numbers led to officers calling everything a contact. Even when a person goes into the station to report a traffic accident. That becomes a police contact. Even when a patrol car transports a citizen, that becomes a contact. And these are the data that are included in stop and frisks. The ACLU didn't know this, nor did the authors of this paper, nor did I. So I assumed that every stop was counted rather than disaggregating it as to the type of stop. The term stop and frisk was never used in the Chicago Police Department. They called them, as Ed mentioned, Terry stops for Terry versus Ohio, and noted as per Terry the reason for the stop on the piece of paper. When Gary McCarthy became chief, he used that term, and even more, he used their number to determine district performance. So while the Terry cards were useful in investigations, if, for example, a burglary was committed in the neighborhood, these stop and frisks became less and less useful in that respect. And that's why it's really important to get a sense of the data beyond just the raw numbers. And when the first version, as Professor Cassell pointed out, of the stop and frisk report came out, it was long and complicated and had a lot of narrative sections that made it difficult to fill out. And now there's a fourth version of the card that makes it much easier to fill out, and I believe that the numbers are going up. But there are other things that have been going on in the city, other than just the ACLU agreement. There was the settlement with the DOJ that required changes in training, I believe. Am I correct about that? And that antedated the change of administration. There was the overall focus on policing in the wake of the Ferguson death and locally Laquan McDonald. And many, including the mayor, have suggested that these may have led to the Chicago police becoming fetal. In fact, one police officer was severely beaten by a person who was high on PCP because she held her fire and didn't want to become the next Ferguson or Laquan McDonald case. But even more important may have been other things that have been going on. In Chicago, we've seen the trend to empty jail cells to provide bonds to people charged with felonies and to release many more juvenile offenders, for example, carjackers who go out and commit similar crimes. These may have been more noticeable to gang members than the reduction in street stops. In other words, what happened at the end of 2015 might have been called a perfect storm that resulted in more homicides in 2016. And with regard to Chicago and New York City, the two homicide problems are very different, as Professor Cassell has pointed out. We're now in the third or fourth generation of gang memberships here. And they are much more integrated into day-to-day life, especially in Englewood and Harrison. This does not seem to be the case in New York City. In the early 90s, the homicide picture began to change. Instead of a high percentage of them being between individuals with a personal connection, more and more had no interpersonal connection, and more like a group or gang connection, and more having to do with the drug trade. A rose may be a rose, but homicides are all different. And how many are street shootings? How many occur indoors? Can we separate those out so we can look at a better dependent variable? And I have a few more points, but I think that that might be enough. And as for correlation versus causation, I think in the paper I read just recently that Typhoid Mary was never found to have the typhoid bacillus, but everywhere she went, typhoid followed. So even though we can't attribute causality in that case, causality is very difficult to attribute in this case as well. And one other quote I'll throw in. Freud used to say, anatomy is destiny. And in this city, we might say, geography is destiny. That's it.
So first I have an omitted variable question, and it's one that I sympathize with because you acknowledge that you lack the data that you need to deal with this question. But most of the homicide increases can be traced to about 11 areas of the city, 11 or 12, so they're very concentrated. And you note that at around the end of 2015, there was a possible change in hotspot policing. And you weren't able to get any details about the ways in which those changes occurred. So that is a possible explanation that I understand you couldn't include, but it seems particularly important to me that that information be pried out of whoever's hands it's in. So if I could turn this into a question, perhaps you could address why you've had some trouble getting this information and what the barrier might be with regard to that. The other question I had is related to the illegal gun seizure statistic. And you mentioned that in the slide presentation, and you talk about it a little bit more in the paper. And here's what I think might be of interest to me with regard to that number. So the number of illegal gun seizures is relatively stable from 2013 to 2016. And one response to the change is the change in stop and frisk numbers is we see a decline from possibly a high of 60,000 per month at the high end, maybe 40, but possibly 60, to a low of 10. But we see a stable number in illegal gun seizures. Now, your response to that in the paper is that we need to understand the value of stop and frisk. It has a deterrent effect. And so a stop of a person who turns out to be innocent of any wrongdoing is in some sense a feature and not a bug of the policy. I mean, perhaps we might call it a form of security theater. It communicates to people that police are out and therefore deters them from carrying a gun, and if they're not carrying a gun, then they're not as likely to use a gun in committing a homicide. But it seems to me that it's a sort of odd form of deterrence because it relies on people believing that the higher number of stop and frisks is increasing their probability of being caught with a gun. But perhaps that's not true. The data suggests that maybe these aren't an effective way to obtain illegal guns. And how much deterrent value can we get, especially in the long run, with a practice that doesn't actually work, but we're counting on people believing it does and therefore deterring them from carrying the guns?
First, I should acknowledge Professor Maltz's comments. I appreciated those comments. As you can tell, this is something I'm very passionate about because I think there are real-world consequences to it. I appreciate your feedback and other feedback as well to try to get to the bottom of what's going on here. Let me see if I can cover, I think there were 3 points. One was, what about this change in hotspot policing? We saw a reference to that in some media source. We need to talk to the Chicago Police Department and others about what that involves. We don't think that that could be the ultimate explanatory change, though, because you wouldn't see a decline in stops. You would just see stops being redistributed across the city if that was what's going on. But it's certainly worth following up, given particularly the indications that hotspot policing is one form of policing that works. Secondly, Professor Maltz talks about this issue of, is our stop data good? And there might be some things that were called stops before that were just, made up sorts of things. We're not denying that out of hundreds of thousands of stops, some of these are not going to be the highest quality stop. But we're looking at changes of, what's the magnitude here? I think 400,000 fewer stops. I mean, give us a couple 100,000 of those and we're still looking at a very significant change in Chicago policing. And by the way, if you don't think that the stop data is good, you've got to think the traffic stop data is good, because that involves a specific form that's pretty obvious and not fudgeable, if you will. And we're able to see an increase in traffic stops in 2016, which means law enforcement power is being sucked away from something else. I mean, it all fits together very neatly, we think. If you think the stop data is bad, I don't think you can think the traffic stop data is bad. And the traffic stop data increased very significantly in 2016, which means policing power was coming from some other thing. The last question is, what about this deterrence? You know, we see that so many of these stops did not produce a firearm seizure. Remember that the stops might be looking at a variety of things, not just firearms. We think that, in other words, our findings support what's known as the deterrence theory rather than the incapacitation theory. And I know that this audience is generally very familiar with that, but let me just take maybe a minute or so to explain how that feeds into the gun debate. There are two ways that a stop could reduce gun violence. One is you catch the bad guy with the gun, identify the gun, and seize it. That's known as incapacitation. You take the gun away, no gun crime. And that is not something that seems to have been happening here in Chicago because gun seizures remain flat. We think what's going on is the bad guy knows that the police are out there stopping and frisking, and we know that the city is awash in guns, so the guns are left behind. And now when somebody's out on the street without a gun, there's less likely to be a gun crime. And that, by the way, is a theory that has been supported not just in our research, but in other research as well that's cited in the paper. So we think Chicago would be a city where deterrence would be more important than incapacitation. New York, by the way, might be different, because apparently it is fairly hard to get a firearm in the city of New York. So if you can take a gun off the street, that might have a very useful incapacitating effect. I think taking a gun off the streets in Chicago is not going to have the same kind of effect, because it can be so readily replaced given the availability of guns. So we think the effect that we're looking at here is a deterrent effect, that if bad guys know that the cops are going to be out there conducting stops that potentially could lead to frisks, that the guns will be left at home, not all the time. Like any deterrence theory, we're not claiming 100% effectiveness. What we are claiming, our numbers show that for about ballparking here, every 500 stops there is one shooting prevented, and every 2,000 stops one homicide is prevented. So that is the deterrent effect in action. Extrapolated over large numbers produces a tragically large number of homicides and shootings that could have been prevented. And again, let me be clear, there's one other point that I think I need to amplify. We think we've quantified to at least some order of magnitude the human costs involved in this change. But we are not calling for a reflexive return to stop and frisk policies at exactly the same point where they were in 2015. We acknowledge that there are trade-offs, and we acknowledge that this city is going to have to debate what level of policing it wants. We're simply asking that those trade-offs be considered as part of the inevitable debate about what is the right level of stop and frisk.
I'm Pat Madison. I come from a background of practitioners. I was on the street as an officer for many years and have spent more than 30 years analyzing police reports, teaching police report writing, addressing the validity question. But I'd like to make just a couple of objective comments. Maybe it's just a side issue. The question was, why was there such a drop from 1 year to the next? Or one of the questions was, why was there such a large drop from 1 year to the next in terms of these contact cards? It takes an officer X amount of time, 15 to 20 minutes, to complete one of these cards. And it has more to do with than just putting information in a box. From an objective perspective, I think it's easy to assume that the officers just don't want to fill out the forms, while on the other hand, it may be some logistical issues.
I think that your research and the presentation you offered us this morning provides a powerful argument that we ought to more carefully consider and scrutinize possible correlation between a change in stop and frisk policy and the increase in gun-related violence. I think that the correlative factors that you've suggested and the meticulous nature of your research gives us all a lot of food for thought, so thank you for that. I had a couple of questions, though, related to some of the additional inquiries you suggest are needed to try and verify or build upon the arguments that you've presented with your colleague. Could you possibly bring up the slide that depicts some of the possible variables or possible factors? With the one at the bottom was the, you know the one I'm referring to, yes. The stop and frisk. At the bottom was in red. That was the one that I think you said leapt out at you as a, because of its, yeah, there we are. So there's a series of factors there. And I guess my general question is, in assessing the likelihood that any of the factors that appear in this list may or may not have been related to the spike in gun violence or these rates, what kind of, that was sort of a quick section of your presentation. What kind of data or what kind of analysis did you apply to some of those other factors that may have, to try and determine whether or not there was any possible correlation there?
So I have the slide up, our hypothesis, and we looked at the one at the bottom. Let's talk, I can give you an illustration. Fractured gang hierarchies we talked about during the talk, that seems to have been a longer term phenomenon, not unique to November of 2015. Mm-hmm. High rates of neighborhood poverty and segregation, not something that changes dramatically over a short period of time, a long-term phenomenon. Influx of guns from other places, we've discussed that. Insufficient penalties for illegal gun carrying, no change in the state laws during 2015 to 2016. By the way, that's one of the complications for research in 2017, because you did pass new gun penalties for repeat gun violence. Social media disputes, something that, again, we don't see any unique change. Facebook didn't come online in November of 2015. It had been around for a while. Demolition of public housing, the timing of that doesn't seem to correspond to the Chicago homicide spike. It seems to have been several years earlier from my understanding, but people around this table are probably more knowledgeable about that. And again, we see a homicide spike that took place, as was mentioned, across the city, particularly on the south and west sides of the city, is I think the way you refer to the areas. That public housing was not uniquely destroyed in all of those areas at the same time. Lack of resources devoted to serious crimes. There was no change in police power in Chicago during the relevant period of time. Police department management and manpower. We've talked about management. Again, manpower remained consistent. Reduced police activity sort of ties into the points we've been discussing. Changes in city and state funding for social services and other core government functions didn't change during the period of time, and we discussed that in the presentation. Absence of family involvement in the lives of youth did not suddenly change in November 2015. Closing of mental health clinics. There were some clinics, I understand some social spending that was reduced, but again, not the kind of thing that would explain a citywide change in homicide rates. Whether we control for in our regressions. We've talked about the McDonald video, U.S. Department of Justice. Let's remember, there was a reference to a consent decree. There was no consent decree ever signed with the federal government. That issue remains in litigation with the Illinois Attorney General, and that may be something that the city of Chicago wants to consider when that consent decree is signed. Will it be implemented in a way, hopefully differently than what appears to have been the way this one was implemented? And a new state law regarding street stops. We discussed this at some length. That new law took effect on January 1st of 2016, but only required a much more abbreviated record-keeping device than did the ACLU agreement. And if you look at other cities in the state of Illinois, we don't see an increase. So we're able to, we believe, discount every other theory that the University of Chicago listed as possibilities.
Well, and that's very helpful. I was interested in that narrative, and I appreciate that. I was also going to mention, just finally, one factor that you may not have considered that could possibly be related to this analysis, and that is the closure beginning in late 2013 of 54 Chicago public schools, high schools, and others that were disruptive in the community and that were the subject of quite a bit of social upheaval and protest. And to the extent that those closures may have contributed to additional youth on the street or displacement in those neighborhoods, that's a factor that I would suggest might be worthy of investigation.
And again, we would wonder about the timing, since that took place several years earlier than the spike. If something happened in 2013, why would it cause a spike in 2016, 3 years later?
I had a question. What you talked about how New York is different. New York had stop and frisk. New York had the squeegee arrests, and crime went down. They ended stop and frisk, and crime didn't go up. What's more disturbing to me is their murder and firearm crimes are so much lower than Chicago. Are we stuck with 500 forever? Is there a way to get down to New York type levels?
Well, I think that's the question that your city leaders need to be asking.
And are we stuck with a flow of guns coming in no matter what we do? It sounds like New York perhaps has friendly states on their borders that are restrictive.
Those are very good questions, and they're not, let me be clear, they're not questions that Professor Fowles and I explored. So we're not, there may well be changes in gun control laws that need to be made. There may well be other lessons that you can pick up from New York. We're just looking at one particular lesson, which is the stop and frisk lesson. Sadly, I don't think anyone has figured out a way to address the sort of underlying level of violence in Chicago. What we're trying to do is address this additional level that seems to be such a recent addition to the problems that the city of Chicago is facing.
All right, we're coming.
I think there was a question.
Yes, Ward One.
Following the release of the Laquan McDonald video that fractured the relationship between the police department and the community, how much of a role do you think that played? Because people in the community may have worked with the police department much closer and provided information regarding people who were involved in certain type activities. And that's huge with the police department being able to know who to put their focus on. But if that relationship was fractured, that probably was a benefit to people who wanted to commit crimes, because if they didn't trust the police department to give information, to help investigate crime, that could have played a role in the significant increase.
Yeah, we agree that that is certainly one hypothesis here, and that's one alternative explanation. I guess one of the things we want to hear from people who are pushing that hypothesis is, how would we test it? We have criminologists around the table here, and if it's going to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. We think that the way that this hypothesis can be falsified is by looking at 911 calls. If the theory is right that police-citizen cooperation declined uniquely after the release of the video, then it should show up in 911 calls. And again, that's not our theory. This is a theory featured in a New York Times op-ed piece describing a very prominent article in the American Sociological Review in 2016 based on this study up in Milwaukee. They said this is the way to detect, and it was based on a highly publicized police misconduct situation that particularly affected minority communities in Milwaukee. But we don't see the same pattern here in Chicago. And by the way, one of the things I haven't mentioned is it doesn't seem like on November 2015, the citizens of Chicago suddenly learned for the first time that there might be some racial issues associated with the Chicago Police Department. I certainly don't mean to make light of that in any way at all. What I mean to point out is that this was there are a wide variety of events, and it's not, as a result, the kind of thing that would seem to trigger a homicide spike in November of 2015. By the way, if it did, there's the other thing that Professor Desmond found was that there's a dissipation effect. That maybe when the video came out, maybe that was a perfect storm of things, but the clouds have to clear at some point. I mean, you can't, again, if we're going to be scientific about this, there should be some half-life, if you will, to that effect. The Desmond study said about 12 to 15 months was the dissipation up in Milwaukee, and we see no evidence over the 12 to 15 months, at least the 12 months that we're looking at, of any dissipation. So again, that leads us to believe that theory does not explain this. Let me be clear, we think we have the best theory, and it's interesting hearing from commentators today. Nobody said, Cassell and Fowles, you all are wrong, the better theory is X. If somebody will give us X, and frankly give us an X that can be tested, we will go look at it. But nobody has given us the competing theory that we can test, and I didn't hear today anybody saying you're wrong, but we may be wrong. What I want to say is at least we've got, I think, the leading candidate right now. And again, our candidate, maybe you say, look, you haven't explained 100% of things, Cassell and Fowles, but have we explained 51%? And will you at least give us that? Because if we have, we're still talking about more than 100 people who died and more than 550 shootings in this city in 2016. So the one thing that Professor Fowles and I want to do is to spark discussion about this. We were again and again struck by the fact, and I can mention, I know there have been some presentations around this city where people have talked about gun violence, for an hour, very knowledgeable, and at the end of the presentation, not a single word about stop and frisk. And I think that's because, let's be honest about it, it's not something that is politically correct. It's not something that gets you applause on the streets of Chicago when you announce the findings. It's frankly something that means you have to think about what kind of a form are you going to present your remarks in. Well, it's pretty easy then to see lots of people out there that are unwilling to talk about that. Professor Fowles and I have the advantage, I suppose, of not being from your city. I'll fly home tonight and won't have to worry about any remarks that I made, but I suspect there are others who would be worried about addressing this topic. Too many people are hurting from this. This needs to be discussed. If we're wrong, figure out what's right. But we think we have a definite explanation and something that is within the power of policymakers in the city of Chicago to change. And that at least deserves discussion. I'm sorry to be emotional about that, but that is the bottom line findings of all the numbers that we're looking at here.
You're one of the most passionate academics I've ever encountered. One other thing that came to mind that I wanted to just briefly ask you about, and this may be a minor or irrelevant factor, but one of the things that we haven't discussed today is the advent of concealed carry in Illinois. Do you think there is any aspect of that policy, and presumably most of the stop and frisk that remove a firearm from a potential offender would be illegal firearms, one could infer. But do you think that concealed carry in any way plays into this conversation or this analysis?
I defer to you on when did concealed carry take effect here in Chicago?
Around 2011.
Yeah.
So if we look at our data begins in 2012, so if that was a unique change, it should have shown up then.
My name is Alice Norris, and as he was saying, I lost my daughter in '93, and there's no way you can tell me I could still be sitting here today, and we have the same problem 25 years, that we haven't been able, and this is like nationwide, to get a handle on these type of killings that goes on in the community. Thing that I'm saying, like 25 years ago, when my daughter was killed, she was a 14-year-old young lady. She was shot in a restaurant. They drove by and shot up the restaurant. When I got down there were bullets cases laying on the ground. And I'm thinking like, why would an ordinary citizen have a gun that shoot that many times? And that began my campaign against gun violence. Because I don't think, when we had the assault weapon was banned then, but then it's back. Now we have all these shootings that have went on at these schools where 15, 25, 30, 50 people can get killed like that. So there's something fundamentally wrong in America and in our country that we can't seem to come to think. And I think the most important thing that I have learned over the years, because this is what I had in my life, is love for each other and to care for each other. That's fundamental, that's missing along these lost little soul children. They can go to school and shoot 15 of their friends. My God. And the one thing that I got this thing, it says, in order for justice to be achieved is when those who are not injured by crime become as indignant as those who are. Just like he is indignant. Well, I am indignant because I lost my wonderful daughter for no reason. And now I work with different parents groups. My group is Purpose Over Pain. All the parents in our group have lost children or relative to gun violence, basically. And I think all of you know, sitting around this room, one parent that I work with, Darian Abbott, was killed in Finger School when they had to fight in the street, and he was killed with a 2x4 about 6-7 years ago. And it's just that when you talk about the stop and frisk, I think they used to have it in Chicago, and then it was some kind of like us, it was racial profiling. They found that more African Americans were being stopped, or Latinos, black and brown. So that was one thing, because they had an anti-loitering law here too, and that was even disproportionately used by the Chicago police to racial profile people. I don't know the answers, but the stop and frisk is fraud, as far as like I can see in Chicago. I no longer live in Chicago, I live in the suburbs now. But I know that it's racial profiling. And when I first moved to one of the suburbs, I knew it was racial profiling because my son-in-law got stopped just about every day going to work. He worked at the airport. So I knew that that's what it was. And then even I was stopped one time, so the police told me, he said, well, because driving my daughter's car, my window was tinted. When he rolled up and saw it was me, he said, oh, okay, go ahead.
Your data showed that gun crime increased after the ACLU, but I think your point at the beginning of your talk was that the gun crime increased, but the other crime seemed to remain pretty much stable. Am I right in that?
Correct.
Then my question, and the other thing is that through the comments that were made a little earlier, there were two functions to stop and frisk, and one of them would be deterrence. Now, my recollection is that Terry versus Ohio, there was not a gun involved in that. It was someone casing a store. Now, if in fact the loss of stop and frisk, or the reduction, the imposition of barriers to stop and frisk greatly reduced stop and frisk, and that's the factor that's operative, why would there not have been at least a modest increase in other crime, such as robbery or burglary, as in Terry versus Ohio, or the casing of a place for burglary or robbery, that would not show up in the statistics? Why is it only gun crime if that stop and frisk is supposed to be a deterrence to other crime or all crime?
I mean, that's an interesting question. You'll notice, by the way, that here's the FBI data you're referring to. Homicides increased 58%. The second largest increase is in robbery, which is a gun-related crime in many situations. It increased 23%. There may be a larger baseline of robbery, so it may be difficult to get the same kind of percentage increase in a larger category than you would see in a much smaller category of crimes. That's one partial explanation. We see across all the shooting crimes these very dramatic increases in gun violence, and it just seems like the stop and frisk activity was uniquely associated with the crimes related directly to shooting violence. Now, we need more. That's why we call for more research. It may be interesting to figure out what was it about the Chicago stop and frisk program that was connected to shooting crimes so directly. There has been other research with targeted patrols, targeted specifically to gun violence. Does Chicago, ties into the hotspot policing, which probably would have been focused on in particular gun violence. Maybe if there was some dissipation of that, might have some effect here. But we don't purport to have all the answers. We just think that our answer explains the spike better than any other theory we've been given.
So thank you all, and thank you very much to the Union League.
Thank you.